In this episode, we talk about what really changes when an agency evolves from managing single work streams to multiple work streams with accounts, and why account management and program management have to grow up along with it. We draw on our own wins and failures as agency operators and dig into how to staff, structure, and segment accounts so growth doesn't turn into chaos and churn.
All right, Sei-Wook. So this is something that's pretty relevant for some of our growing agencies. And I think one way to kind of set the table is, when agencies are kind of in their infancy or earlier days, many of them start with kind of single work streams with clients. So that might be a project, let's say a website redesign, or it might be a single kind of retainer, let's say a email retention retainer, or maybe a SEO retainer. And you're just stacking those single work streams per client on top of each other and trying to manage best as you can. And maybe that gets assigned to a account manager or project manager who handles a bunch of these as a pod. But as you do a great job for clients, sometimes the clients are like, hey, we got more stuff for you to help us with. And that's when, you go from a single work stream to multiple work streams. And this is what we're here to talk about today.
Yeah, definitely. I think the concept here is thinking about project management where you have single work streams to this concept of program management where you're addressing multiple different projects or lines of work with a single client.
So maybe we can kind of dive into just more of the specifics of that. Like when you go from a single work stream to multiple work streams, what actually changes? Like what are some of the things that agencies should be aware of as hey, these are some new challenges or complications that arise?
Yeah. Usually when you have distinct different work streams, there might be different stakeholders on the client side. So somebody that manages email could be different than someone who manages a website at an agency. So there's just more people to interface with and who are responsible for the different projects and the work streams that you're working on.
But also on the client side, right? So you're saying on the client side, there might be somebody, somebody who's let's say a director of e-com does one thing, but then there might be somebody who's more brand marketing or more analytics or whatever that has different responsibilities.
Yep. Yeah. And there can also internally, both on the client side, there could be more and more interdependencies. It's not just parallel projects that don't have to talk to each other. Let's say an email has to go to a landing page. So suddenly the web team needs to know to create a landing page that the email team is sending traffic to. So there's more and more coordination that's required there.
Yeah. And then just in terms of managing all these work streams, what happens there?
Yeah, then you start to have deadlines, multiple deadlines. So it's not just if you work on one project, everything happens pretty linearly. Now you can have the email, the web, the SEO deadlines all happening at the same time. So if it's the same team internally or the same person managing it, it can be a higher cognitive load on the account managers or the project managers on the client side.
Yeah. And then just the other part is obviously the planning and the scoping and just okay, how does this all tie to helping deliver results for the client? And I think we've experienced it ourselves where it's you can have a lot of work streams, but if they don't kind of have a deliberate overarching kind of strategy to it, it could be kind of wasteful / not as effective, right?
Yeah, and then there's definitely opportunities for misalignment. If you're just thinking about things in silos, then you don't realize how things get interconnected, and there could be different priorities or goals that could cause some conflict between teams.
Yeah. So before we dive into some tactical and specific ways that smaller agencies can evolve to a multi-work stream shop, let's talk about how the big boys do it. The big agencies that have kind of this infrastructure really built out. And some of this obviously has been an evolution for them as well as they've scaled and kind of dealt with complexity, huge multinational global clients. But what have we observed from kind of the big agencies?
Yeah, there's definitely a few different levels. So I'll start kind of at call it the highest level, but the account leadership. So account leadership is in place to handle really the senior relationship with the client, and their top priority is business growth, right? And managing. Yeah. So they're not at the project level. It's all about the relationship and the goal setting. Working with that is program management. Program management oversees entire ecosystem of the different work streams. So they are responsible for orchestrating like when the things happen, who needs to talk to who, and basically it's yeah, they have the top level view of all the different engaged work streams happening. And then you have work stream leads who handle their own work stream level strategy and delivery. So to our examples earlier, like there could be a web work stream on one area, there could be an email work stream on another area. They're each responsible for delivering and the strategy at that tactical level.
Yeah. And for these big kind of global agencies, it could be like some folks managing certain channels, for example, like, hey, there's some traditional stuff, some social media type of stuff, and different kind of, and even within that, you could have multiple work streams as well. So there's like kind of layers to this as you scale and get bigger and bigger, right?
Yeah. And definitely from a cadence and planning standpoint, quarterly planning becomes more and more important where there's bigger planning sessions where you're looking out ahead at the next quarter, but also the next year, and just overarching, have longer visibility into everything that's happening. And then from that, there's a lot more demand on the team to have clear documentation and brief writing to be used across work streams that bubble up and are related to the overarching goal there.
Yep. And just kind of going back to what you said about account leadership. And one of the things we're actually not assigning specific titles to these levels because depending on the agency, they're called very different things, right? Like in some account leadership could be led by a managing partner or like a global account director or whoever. Like there's so many different ways to kind of label these things. And even at the program management level, even at the workstream level, people are called different things. So we're just kind of avoiding assigning specific titles to these things. But at the account leadership level, the other piece I think is the strategic kind of oversight, the vision, like the co-creation of the vision with the client on kind of what they want to achieve, just all that stuff. I think, yeah, like how does that bubble up to account leadership and also kind of work its way down to the rest of the team?
Yeah, I think the big thing there is just having different roles so that it's not like one person handling all and having that clear separation, the responsibilities, right? And then having ongoing communication to make sure that everyone is aligned, right? It's account management needs to communicate with program management to know what the priorities are. Program management needs to talk with the work stream leads to know in what order to do things, and then vice versa. If there are issues, they kind of bubble up the other direction. And account management is then responsible for smoothing that over with the clients.
Yeah. And I think one thing that you take away from this is that like at the account leadership level, these folks really have to be great at the relationship building, seeing opportunities, but also driving the strategy, overall strategy, and which means like understanding the business of the client very deeply. So let's talk about like what can smaller agencies learn? And, I think we can kind of weave in some of our own experiences as well. But let's start with like, yeah, what are some simple things that smaller agencies that are just mostly single work stream right now, but maybe starting to get a few multiple work stream clients here and there, what can they learn?
From the big boys, there are many different levels, but at a smaller agency, just thinking about just separating from client leadership or the relationship level activities from the execution coordination. So that could be like the agency leadership being the main kind of relationship with the client, and then you might have like project managers, for example, handling the day-to-day execution of different work streams. So just having some separation between execution and strategy and leadership.
Yeah. So basically, one way to kind of invert that is avoid a situation where, let's say you're an agency founder, you have a client who's kind of giving you multiple work streams and you're like, hey, PM, project manager, you handle everything, including the client relationship. And that's when things could go wrong, right?
Yeah, definitely. Cool. Yeah. Another thing is just thinking about kind of the cadence of communication. So we talked before about having those quarterly planning sessions. So thinking about that you can kind of bubble it down from quarterly planning to monthly, taking a look at the strategy on what's changing to maybe it's a weekly internal cadence and sync so that all the different work streams are synced up on exactly what the other teams are working on. So just making sure, because more work streams means more complexity. So more communication to help with that.
Yeah. And a lot of the conversations are around like client status, like, hey, is there anything that's kind of problematic or we just need to flag early as something to address? Because this is how you ensure that the relationship is healthy and all the different team members are kind of hitting all cylinders. And then, you mentioned this earlier about just kind of some of the communication between the levels, but maybe talk more about like escalation paths and like what are they useful for, especially for small agencies? What should they prioritize?
Yeah, the things that a lot of things could bubble up, but more commonly as you kind of work through an engagement is like things like scope creep. A client, this work stream contact is asking for more things. Is that something that could be resolved at the work stream level, or should it be escalated to the account leadership who can then either ask for more budget or try to smooth things over? Or if it doesn't have to be a scope issue, but it could be if there's an issue, like we're missing a deadline or there's an issue with execution, being clear with who handles what kinds of communication. So it's not the project level people having conversations that should be happening at the client leadership level.
Yeah, that's key. And you mentioned like documentation is important. Can you touch upon like, because brief writing, I think a lot of small agencies aren't used to that. And so what are some takeaways for small agencies that adopt kind of the practice of brief writing? And how should we think about that?
Yeah, we've seen a varying level of complexity of brief writing, but I think it starts with onboarding and having a really clear, it could be a document outlining like who is the client, what is our history with them, what are all the work streams, what's happening in their business that could affect us. And then the briefs could go into exactly what the initiative is. You can talk about parallel work that's happening at the agency, and then what are kind of the key goals that we're trying to achieve through that. So it's adding one more step to think about what are other people doing that could affect the one work stream that I'm working on.
Yeah. And I think if you want to take it one level deeper, you could involve and you could collaborate a lot closely with the client in co-creating the brief initially, get their sign off, make sure like, hey, everything here is in a good place so that before you onboard your own team members, it's like you've kind of had this alignment with the client. Because one of the worst things that we've experienced is when you write this brief, you onboard a team, they're working on something, but then the client is totally at odds with what the client thought it was, and you could run into some real trouble then.
Thanks for listening to Agency Habits Podcast. A quick heads up, Barrel Holdings is acquiring agencies. We look for profitable firms with durable revenue and strong teams. If you're thinking about succession, de-risking, or scaling with a partner, visit barrel-holdings.com to see our buy box and set up a confidential call. Thanks.
One interesting thing that also could happen is your team could be more in sync than the client side. So the client could have no idea that this other team was working a parallel initiative. But if you're working on a brief together or they're kind of in the loop, then they could also be more in tune with all the parallel work streams.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And so just to clarify, like that is like, especially if clients you're working with multiple client stakeholders and like they're not talking to each other. In the process of the brief writing, you end up surfacing that for them so that they become more in sync with each other, right? So yeah, that's huge. Okay, cool. So and we're talking about a lot of this from our own experience. And I think a lot of it was a pretty painfully lived experience of like not quite understanding the structure needed to support multiple work streams. And so you could talk about a couple examples just from our days as agency operators, especially let's go back to Barrel when we had a period where I think for a long time we were single work stream, like website redesign shop, right? People come in, you do a website, you're good to go. But then over time, I think we layered it on because some clients, they needed multiple websites. And then sometimes we did email marketing. Sometimes we did SEO and sometimes we added on other services. And so all of a sudden, we were able to kind of have this content creation, creative, ad creative, whatever. We were able to like sell in a program. So we were like, hey, look, we're going to help you grow the next year and be really part of this kind of transformation of you going to market with XYZ products or whatever. So we sell these in, but more often than not, we ran into some challenges. But maybe we could talk about a few examples where we did figure some stuff out and then where other places we fell a little bit short.
Yeah. I'll think back to our experience with, I'll name the brand, Kind Snacks. We did a lot of work for many years, and the engagement started with redesigning their website. So that had multiple stakeholders from the IT side and the brand side on their end, but still very kind of single work stream type of process. As that engagement kind of came to a close, one work stream was maintaining the site, and that's typically with the IT team or people who are more on the technical side. But then there are many campaign needs. So as a growing brand, they did initiatives like we did one with like Kevin Durant, where it's like a whole new product line with a whole new brand. And suddenly you're working with a brand team and a team working on like the advertising for this one initiative that is going in parallel to some of the other work. And then they had a nonprofit arm to Kindstacks that got created. So then we're working with a nonprofit team, and suddenly, like, you have many parallel tracks touching maybe in some cases like the same technical foundation. And then email came into play. So now we're managing different monthly, weekly emails that have to go out. And like all of these had different stakeholders. Like a different person on the client team is handling each part. And there's some coordination, but the same challenge that we talked about where not everyone is talking to each other. Sometimes they expect like IT to be the glue. These are much, larger things. The CMO is involved, but are they the really, they're not really involved in the day to day. So we had to take on that responsibility to organize things. And from our journey, we had to kind of grow into that structure. We're very much a project management producers who just managed all the work. And then as things grew, for us, it was like the company leadership became the effective account leaders. And then we introduced another layer to do called program management. At the time, we called it like an account lead. And then we had project managers or producers to do the execution on the work streams. So it was a iterative process where we had to learn how to build an account team along the way over several years.
The interesting thing here is that, like, in hindsight, it's like so clear where we kind of made some mistakes, but some of the accounts that performed really well were ones where, like, myself, you, a couple other leaders that, like, we effectively played a heavy hand in both account leadership and program management. So we were like making sure that everyone's kind of coordinated, doing their thing. But like the moment we got busy and took our eyes off of program management or weren't doing the account leadership to kind of grow the account, like a lot of things would fall apart. And like, I think we hit a limit where, maybe with 1, 2, 3 of these type of clients, it was fine. Like we could juggle it. But I think the moment it became like 4, 5, 6 of these types of accounts, and then we didn't have the personnel to either be account leads, program managers. And then basically we went, hey, we would just ask, some of our most effective producers to kind of run with all of it. Like we just basically put all the responsibilities on them. And I mean, the burnout rate was high, and it was just, I could just see in hindsight, like how much of a structural challenge it was for us to kind of manage these accounts.
Yeah, I think we didn't have kind of the mental model in place to think about this. Like for this account in particular, like we didn't think about like the account leadership versus program management. We tried to like push it down into the same role where we're saying, all right, your title is account lead or account manager. You should be able to do the account management strategic work, but also oversee all the different lines of work that are happening. Like it's 2 roles in one, and it never quite worked out because they're also likely working on many other things on top of that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, those are harder lessons. And I think just, part of it was just not knowing what we didn't know. And also, this is why I think it's good to study some of these more kind of built out larger agencies with the infrastructure, because there's some things that we can take from it. Obviously, if you try to emulate exactly what they're doing, it could be too heavy. So you got to kind of find that right middle ground for all this to kind of make sense. Yeah. So just one other story that we could kind of share is kind of our experience with like paid media, like growth marketing. It's something that we try to expand into. And it was actually at some point it was not an insignificant part of our revenue, and we had grown it. But I think because we were like web first, and then this was something we added on top of that, the selling it was not hard. It was compelling because it was at that time, it's like, oh, you're doing the web. Hey, you guys can do also our paid, and we have one agency that we can rely on to deliver all this. And we pitched hard on the synergies of like, hey, you're going to get a great kind of integrated type of experience from us. But the truth was like, we lacked the structure because we didn't have that program management structure, and also like just even an account lead, honestly, to kind of set strategy on how web and paid might work together, like bringing it all together. It was very siloed. And like, I think some of the more painful moments were when, like I'd overhear in meetings or something, like one team blaming the other for whatever issues. And it's like, oh my goodness, we're the same team here. And for the client to hear that is just kind of embarrassing, but also, it's just really hurtful to kind of how we present ourselves. And I think for us, I mean, we ended up kind of phasing out the paid media, the growth team, because there were a few instances where, the performance of the paid not coming through jeopardized the entire account. Because I think at that point, the client's like, hey, I don't care like if web is good and paid is the problem, but like you guys I can't trust you guys as an agency. And so I think that risk kind of scared us into kind of being like, all right, we could just get rid of growth marketing as soon as possible. But I'd say like in hindsight, like I think with good kind of structure in terms of like, yeah, like a way for these kind of teams to communicate better, plan better, and have this kind of sync the operating rhythm of like checking in together, we could have avoided these issues.
Yeah, and I think that is always a risk when you have multiple work streams, and one of those work streams taking down the rest of the relationship. I think that's where what really matters there is having strong account leadership and that relationship with the client and building that trust and for them to see the value that you're providing beyond just that one work stream could be faltering for a period of time, but working through that, I think that is the importance of having those separate levels.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so just one more topic to touch upon before we wrap up is around client segmentation. So we talked about the evolution from single work stream to multiple work streams for like a small agency. But the truth is like, it's not like overnight you go from only doing single to only doing multiple work streams for clients. Like there's going to be a period, and this happens for large agencies too, where, you're going to have different types of accounts where some super heavy. They're going to be the ones that require a lot more team members, a lot more kind of attention. And then there's going to be those that are a bit more single one project and done, or just kind of one retainer that's kind of ongoing. And so, yeah, like we should kind of talk about client segmentation and how should agencies think about how to segment their clients.
Yeah, it's definitely not a one size fits all solution. And it's thinking about the potential of accounts. I think for us, is there a potential to get to a multi workstream situation? Or is this client, they don't have those needs, or they're very well serviced in other areas, or maybe there's someone internal that's handling it. So that's not at least a short term potential. And then, like, are you in a position to look at a year-long budget so you can do some planning together? Do you have access to those senior stakeholders who make those decisions? And if there is like a really complicated org structure on the client side, that often means like maybe there's potential that you can grow into and target some more, yeah, more brands, more work streams within that one client. So that's, yeah, you identify it as like the high potential, high touch client account that you can put the attention on.
Yeah, and I think this is like a worthwhile exercise for any agency, and which is like just go through your client roster. And I think a term that's popularly used for this is like just, yeah, what are your key accounts? Because once you identify your key accounts, then you can really figure out, okay, these are accounts that we're already doing a lot of work for, or like, hey, we're doing some amount of work, but it's picking up and it has high potential for growth. And so we're going to put a lot of resources into that. And at the same time, for the ones that, you kind of identify as low potential, basically it's like don't overservice or kind of put too many resources into something that is going to have limited upside. But obviously do a good job and make sure to do what you've promised to do. But yeah, you got to kind of be smart about where you're deploying your time and resources.
Yeah, and all these things that we're talking about, like it can be very expensive to have this layer of management for an account. So if the account is small, doesn't have potential, like it can crush your margins really quickly on a very small account if you overdo it on the structure standpoint. But for the right clients, like it'll pay for itself because I would say the retention of that and the growth potential, so retention of the work, growth potential of those accounts could absorb the increased overhead on the management end.
Yeah, not to mention, I mean, it just
Yeah.
brings the cost of sale down, right? Like just the customer
Yeah.
acquisition cost just is with existing clients goes down quite a bit. So I think if you take that into account, for sure, I do think there's like maybe a critical mass. It'll vary depending on the agency, but it's not uncommon to have like maybe like $250,000, $500,000, $1 million kind of like threshold for what kind of some of these larger accounts should be, so that to support the team and the type of work that's needed to service it. So you got to think much bigger than kind of the single project mentality.
Yep.
Yep.
Right.
All right. So I think that kind of brings us to the end here. So just to kind of sum it up, maybe some lessons for smaller agencies as they kind of think about going from single work streams to multiple work streams. Mention a few.
Yeah, I think when thinking about adding services in your agency, think about how you can coordinate and plan for it before you just start selling in things. So make sure the structure's in place, or at least think about the structure. And then along those lines, don't just assume that a single person, like a project manager, can handle all the different work streams and potentially handle the client relationship at the same time.
Yep.
Yeah, and then along those lines, as you continue to scale, think about how you can unify the work. So it's not just like siloed, like three siloed teams reporting separately to a client that aren't talking to each other. Just thinking about the coordination on that side.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Yeah. And then obviously, like just for account managers, just monitoring their workloads because, yeah, once you kind of put an account on them, it's quite a bit of responsibilities. And so, yeah, just monitoring that and just knowing, hey, look, it's, there's only so much one person can do. And then what we talked about with our experience in paid media, like don't assume clients will separate good from bad inside your agency. They'll just kind of oftentimes evaluate the sum of everything. And then you mentioned this earlier about, look, planning before adding kind of lanes to the work streams. And then, yeah, just lastly, you mentioned this as well, like program management can pay for itself, especially in margin and retention. So investing in it early is worthwhile. And I think this is for us in hindsight, it's like, hey, if we could do it again, we'd probably be more kind of intentional about the structure we build out. That's what we have kind of on this topic. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.